Thank you very much, Michelle. Everybody hear me okay? So first of all, I want to say thank you for attending. This is a new area for the Green Grid, and I'll talk a little bit about kind of what it means and why it's significant in a moment. But this is new for the Green Grid for a couple of reasons. We started in on this. I mean, for those of you who are familiar with the Green Grid, in 2007 when we kicked off, we focused around energy consumption and we focused around data centers. We always left ourselves open for looking at a wider range of IT and looking at a wider range of issues, but we really felt initially as we were doing our work that we needed to stay tightly focused on energy in the data center. What we found over the past 2 years, though, is that our industry has been asking us to take a broader look into a wider range of sustainability issues. So at the end of 2010, we introduced metrics for carbon usage effectiveness and water usage effectiveness, not because we had decided at the beginning of 2010 that we wanted to take this foray into some of these other resource areas, but because we found that both our membership and our advisory council said these are issues that we need you to look at. And so as we've been getting more and more comfortable working in the sustainability space, one of the things that we've found is that things that might have seemed out of scope for the Green Grid back in 2007 are really starting to become very tightly interlocked with some of the things that we do on a daily basis. So as we look at energy efficiency, for example, those of us who have done modeling into data centers and have looked at server populations and server energy efficiency frequently come to the conclusion that one of the best ways that you can run an energy efficient data center is make sure that you're running state-of-the-art stuff. Make sure that you have a pretty frequent and aggressive hardware refresh policy. Now that works fine in our room, in our circles. But when we get outside of the Green Grid's room, when we start talking to other people who address issues about sustainability, we start to get some questions like, well, okay, so are you going to save energy with this brand new server? But that brand new server takes energy to produce. The brand new server has got embedded emissions in its manufacturing. Can you guarantee me that the energy that you're going to save is going to be more than the energy it takes to create that brand new server? And then the really up-to-date folks and the really sharp folks are going to ask the next question, which is, you want to refresh your hardware. What are you going to do with the stuff that you're done with? When you refresh servers every 5 years, you're not disposing of quite as much stuff as when you're refreshing servers every 4 years or every 3 years. So we started to realize that we were going to have to take a look at some of these broader issues of sustainability. Otherwise, we might end up making recommendations in one area that would be seen as counterproductive by folks in another. So a little over a year ago, we started looking at a recycling metric for end users of information and communications technologies. So the folks who have the data centers, who have the equipment, how can they measure themselves to determine if they're handling that material responsibly at the end of life or the end of current use? We now have, as of yesterday, we have the white paper published on the Green Grid site introducing electronics disposal efficiency, meant to be a relatively easy to use metric to understand the disposition of IT assets at end of use. In addition, one of the things that we believe as well is that as the data center maturity model itself evolves and we start adding stuff to the maturity model, these sorts of issues about product carbon footprint, life cycle analysis, and disposition of products at end of use start to become best practices, and they're going to find their way into the maturity model. So I have to I end up frequently giving kind of my next 30 seconds or 45 second speech in multiple venues because, is that better? Hey, wait a minute, all of a sudden I'm louder. And because it's known, but maybe sometimes not generally appreciated, that there are two camps of green IT. There's the one that we're familiar with in the Green Grid. These are the folks who are paying attention to the data center, very interested in energy, interested in greenhouse gas emissions, kind of very tightly focused. That's what green IT is to us in our community. But there's another community out there. There's the community that pays attention to what goes on in the office environment, the community that pays attention to what goes on in the consumer environment. offices, factories, where they're looking at desktops, laptops, workstations. That crowd typically is far more interested in what are the materials of construction for products and what happens to products when they reach end of life than they are about energy or emissions. These two groups have completely different conferences. They have completely different sets of papers. They interact and they come together occasionally but infrequently. But once again, we find as we start really digging into some of these issues on what's traditionally been our side, the energy and emissions side, we find that we've got to go into that other side. We've got to bring the two of them together. And more we're seeing that. More and more we're seeing where the folks who are interested in energy and emissions related issues are having to become aware of what's going on in the areas of materials of construction, waste, recycling, take back. And by the way, that's going to happen for the other group as well. The folks who have been dealing with materials and waste are going to have to become more and more aware of what's going on in the energy and emissions side. So we realized we needed to kind of tackle this problem. Now, one of the things that is not an advantage for the green grid is that most of the folks in the technical community of the green grid know next to nothing about recycling and take back and what happens to products when we're done with them. We know really well how to install them. We know really well about how to run an efficient power and cooling architecture for a data center. Once we're done with it, we turn it off, we take it out of the rack, it's somebody else's problem. And so we've had to really look outside of the green grid for domain expertise. Now, what the green grid's really good at is understanding what does go on in the operations of a data center and what does go on in the operations of an IT organization, and what works for that sort of organization when it's looking at managing its operations, when it's looking kind of tracking its behavior and improving over time. So we were really looking upon this as an activity where we could bring two things together that haven't been brought together before. Maybe it's the Reese's peanut butter cup of metrics, where we could start developing relationships with folks who do have the domain expertise in this area and bring what Green Grid has to bring to the table, which are the connections into the data center and IT industries. So some of the goals we set for the metric, once again, because we do metrics and we know what's important for them is first of all, the high level goal, the domain goal is how do we measure how well we're disposing of equipment when we're done with it. We want to provide some guidance to a crowd that may not typically be familiar with these issues as to what responsible disposition or responsible management means. We want to make sure this material is entering the right pathways. We want to make sure that the stuff gets into the right recycling and reuse standards. We also want to make sure it's simple. It's not something that's so arcane that nobody can implement. That's something that folks can understand. So this is the high-level description of the metric. And once again, like with PUE, the high-level description can be fairly simple. The devil's in the details when you kind of get down into how you calculate it and what it means. And it's really the percentage of all electronic waste or the material that is to be disposed of, the percentage of it that you can guarantee has gone to a responsible channel at end of life over compared to the total amount of material that's leaving your organization. By the way, and in all cases, it's going to be less than 100%. I just want to set that ground rule now because we had some issues with PUE early on about boundaries and numbers. And the key, kind of the magic in this, is the definition of responsible. What does responsible disposition mean in these cases? So this is kind of where we started. There were some additional work that we referenced early on. Once again, looking at a lot of work from some of the domain experts, and I'll mention some of those at the end of the presentation. But also I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a paper that Emerson had done earlier on kind of looking at this exact problem about how do we measure the disposition of assets at end of use. So because Green Grid are not typically the experts in recycling take-back, we had to set some ground rules for ourselves. We had to kind of figure out who's the target of the metric, who's not the target of the metric, what are their goals, how do we define responsible, what about terms? So we also found something very interesting in terms of calculation. I think I get to that actually in the next slide. So this is meant to be a metric for end users, like PUE. It's meant to be a metric for folks who have servers have desktops, have laptops, have workstations, commercial environments, commercial consumers of IT. Producer metrics for recycling and take-back exist. Right? Metrics on folks like Dell, HP, IBM, Fujitsu, Cisco, Oracle. Metrics for producers exist. That's not what's needed. What's needed is something for end users of IT to be able to measure themselves with. Now, I did put in here out-of-scope IT EEE manufacturers, but that's only from a point of view of manufacturing the equipment. From the point of view of its own operations, Dell is as much an in-scope for this organization as is anybody else, because just like we manufacture the stuff, we are also consumers of the IT equipment ourselves. So goals. We want to incent responsible disposition, responsible disposal of electronics equipment at end of use, end of current use, end of life. For those who are familiar with the domain, there are a lot of conflicts within various organizations on the materials and waste side of green IT as to what constitutes e-waste and what constitutes acceptable behavior. And so we didn't want to make a recommendation at this time as to the particular type of disposal. We're not going to tell you that, say, donating equipment is better than putting it into a landfill, or tearing it apart for components is better than refurbishing. That's not the goal of the metric. It's not here to tell you what to do. It's here to say that, whatever you think is right for your organization, look at those waste streams, look at who the recipients are, and make sure that those recipients are handling the material in a responsible manner. We also didn't want the green grid to go off and redefine other organizations' work. Once again, we're great in energy, we're great in emissions, but there are domain experts who've been working on this problem for a long time in other areas, and we don't want to rewrite their books. We don't want to try to rewrite their standards or their glossaries. So wherever possible, we wanted to leverage the work that's been done by these organizations, reference it, cite it, use their definitions. The only time when we wanted to kind of create something for this metric from the green grid is if we find a place where there really are no clean industry definitions whatsoever, no clear industry definitions for specific pathways. And I don't think to date we have found any of those, although it's certainly possible as this evolves that we're going to find some in the future. Same holds true for Glossary. We don't want to create any new definitions. We don't want to create any new interpretations. We want to leverage the work that these other organizations have done, the great work that these other organizations have done, really reference it and tie back to it, because these are the organizations that are going to be building on this work in the future. And then last, in terms of a use model, like with PUE, the guidance that we gave early on with PUE is we want an organization to use this to measure itself against itself over time. There are going to be so many variations in situations and environments that different organizations are going to be in that at the moment it doesn't really seem to make sense to use this metric to compare how well company A is doing against how well company B is doing. The metric's intent is for an organization to use this to improve its own results over time, and by the way, help point out areas where the industry as a whole may need to do some work to enable us all to do a little bit better. Now this slide is titled Scope of Metric Development, but I think it was really meant to be scope of calculation or scope of use. So when you attempt to use the metric or calculate the metric, here's what's in and out of scope. First, in going with the guidelines that we didn't want to recreate any terminology, we didn't want to redo any definitions ourselves, we went to the European Commission annexes and directives on waste of electronic equipment, the WEEE directives. And in those directives, there's category 3, which describes a whole bunch of different types of computing equipment, and it's all in annexes 1 or 2, which I guess is the European version of what I would call an appendix. But annexes 1 to 2, category 3 describe a very, very specific set of equipment types. And one of the things that we realized, which is, once again, one thing that's different about this metric from any other work that the Green Grid's doing, is it's operating in that other side of green IT. The other precedent that this metric sets for the Green Grid is we very quickly came to the realization that we had to be looking at more than just the data center. So really, this is meant to look at an entire IT organization when we looked at the definitions for what's considered electronic waste, they don't separate out servers from laptops, from workstations. They define all of these within that category 3 in the WEEE directive. So for us to really have a metric that makes sense, the scope of the metric has to cover an entire IT organization and not just a data center. And once again, that makes it something very new for the Green Grid. One of the things we were talking about as well, by the way, I lifted this table right from the white paper, which I'll say again, is available today on the Green Grid website. Ownership. You know, if you've got a piece of equipment, who counts that piece of equipment? And the decision that we made is it's the organization that controls the decision on when and how that equipment has reached the end of life. So if you are a colo provider and you have leased space to an organization and that organization has come in and they have brought their own server in and they're deciding when they're going to take that server out and they're done with it, that organization is responsible for keeping account and tracking that particular asset. If you are a cloud provider and you have provided space for a piece of equipment and you have put the equipment in there and you provide services to somebody else based on that piece of equipment, but you're the organization that determines when that equipment has become obsolete and when you're going to take it out of use, then you're responsible for keeping account for that piece of equipment in the metric. This also includes stuff that's leased, owned, operated, hosted within reporting organizations' facilities. If the assets are not operated by the organization, regardless of where the assets are owned or leased, then those are out of scope for this. Reuse. We went through a lot of discussions as to kind of different pathways, and if you're going to take let's say that I'm an academic organization and I take a server out of a data center and I go take that server and I go move it under a professor's desk and let him run it under his desk without telling anybody, that doesn't count in the metric because you're still keeping it within your organization. It may have reached the end of its current use, but you've still kept it within your organization and repurposed it. So it doesn't get included in the metric. Organizational scope. This was a big decision that we made on our part. This is not meant for company Q to use to measure for its North American operations while ignoring the rest of its operations worldwide. It's meant to be a globally applied metric. One of the important reasons for that is that there are certain parts of the world where there are pretty sophisticated supply chains for recycling and take-back, and there are parts of the world where some of these supply chains are not that sophisticated. One of the hopes that we have with the metric is that we can start to identify and surface areas where we might need a little bit more rigor in this process to make sure that we're not dumping waste where we don't need to be dumping it. So once again, it's meant to be all global facilities owned by an organization and not just a select few. We would frown upon somebody saying, hey, we're going to measure ourselves in the location where we know we've got nothing but stellar recyclers and we're going to ignore our results everywhere else. That's a little bit out of bounds. So let's talk a little bit about responsible disposition, because this is some of the kind of most contentious parts of the metric and what we're doing. In general, a process is responsible if it's looking to minimize the environmental impact of the disposal of the equipment. It's looking to maximize the recovery of embedded materials within that particular disposition pathway, looking to kind of maximize the recovery of the usable components, materials, energy, before resulting to final disposal. So if you're going to give this to somebody who's going to go and tear it apart for components, then that organization should really be effective at making sure it's not throwing useful components away. We're really looking to kind of prevent and minimize impacts to the environment and human health through disposition of the equipment. Now, in practice, what that means is that you want to be working with organizations that have managed to have themselves certified under some certain third-party certification standards for recycling. And once again, one of the other things we didn't want to do is we didn't want to declare a winner in the document because some of these issues are very contentious across the planet, and we want to say, look, we're interested in making sure you meet a certain minimum set of requirements, but we're not going to go tell you to use that standard. So some of the ones that are most common are a standard called R2 by an organization called Resolve, and the EStewards specification which I think is run and managed by the Basel Network or the Basel Convention. There are a few others, We Label X, Ontario Electronic Stewardship. What we're looking for is to make sure that the folks that we give material to are following one of these standards. Now, when these materials are processed in the recycling stream, typically, our organizations can obtain certificates of recycling or reuse as proof of compliance from our downstream suppliers or downstream vendors. Something else we did describe is that there are some organizations throughout the world that have been doing a lot of work themselves and have their own fairly sophisticated means for ensuring that material is handled responsibly. We don't want to penalize those organizations for the good work that we did. So in addition to something like R2 or EStewards, if you have an internal program and you can show first that somebody outside of your company reviewed your program to make sure that it was the equivalent of something like R2 or EStewards. So you've had somebody from outside check your work. You've got a governance process like ISO 14001 if it's specifically focused on your program to guarantee that you're following the program that you created for yourself. And if there's third-party oversight, somebody outside of your organization who can say, you know what, they said they were going to do this, you know, it met all the requirements at the beginning, they had their governance process to guarantee they're going to do it, and we've taken a look at it, and by golly, they did everything that they said that they were going to do. If you've got third-party review of the initial program, governance, and third-party oversight, then that's something that we would consider to be equivalent to something like the R2 or the EStewards standard. So we wanted to provide, I'm providing you with a summary of a lot of the information that's in the white paper. We wanted to provide a little bit of, I'm not sure I'd call it education, but a briefing for folks who are not generally familiar with the space. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what some of the disposal pathways are for decommissioned electronics equipment, and also reiterate, we're not making recommendations for specific pathways. Nobody's going to slap you on the wrist if you're not donating all of your used equipment to some wonderful nonprofit who's then going to take it. Every organization has different issues and situations they have to address, right? So you want to do what's right for your organization. We just want to make sure that the recipient handles it in a responsible way. System reuse is the highest level. In general, these go from kind of the how much value you're able to retain in disposition. And you retain the greatest value when the system can be reused. It's decommissioned from one use, pulled off of a rack, it goes to another organization outside of your organization that's able to make use of the equipment as is. That's the way to maintain the greatest value in the equipment as it's disposed of. If the system cannot be reused as is for whatever reason, I got to put a bullet hole through the hard drive because I've got data security issues, for example. You can start looking at component reuse, where subsystems or parts of the product are reused. Whoever you hand it to maybe refurbishes it, or they rebuild it, or they take the memory out, or they take the processors out and they reuse that equipment in other devices, right? Once again, this idea that that's kind of the next level down in terms of retaining value in the product as it's disposed. If component reuse is not possible, then we want to look at system recyclers. And for those of us who love our machines, it's kind of generates tears when we see servers go into big shredders that do nothing but chop them up and turn them into small bits of plastic and metal. But there are occasions when that's really the best thing to do with some of these products, and there are rules for these recyclers as well to make sure that as they go through this and they tear our systems down to little tiny bits, they do so in a way that kind of minimizes the effect on the environment. The last pathway is one that really retains the least value, and that's if all else fails. Right? You can't reuse the system, you can't reuse the components, it doesn't make sense to recycle the material for whatever reason, that there are cases where a piece of equipment has to go into a landfill or it has to be incinerated. And once again, there are rules and guidance for organizations that do this sort of work to make sure that as they put equipment into a landfill or as they incinerate it, they minimize the effect of that operation on the environment. All of these pathways can be managed responsibly. They can all be managed irresponsibly. That's why we look for things like R2 and EStewards to make sure that our supply chain at the end of life is handling things in a responsible manner. We put a little chart in the white paper to talk about, just to provide some awareness to our community of who some of these organizations are that manage material downstream. So we kind of put together a little chart, a little table of the sorts of organizations that you might be working with and the types of processes that they do. At the top, we put the organizational consumers of electronic equipment. And so these are our end users. These are the folks who we're looking to present the metric to. They're the ones who are going to be doing original system use. They may also be reusing systems internally as they take it from one purpose and repurpose it within an organization. You've got the original equipment vendors, the folks who made the stuff in the first place. Dell, Dell, HP, IBM, Fujitsu, Cisco, Oracle, the whole list of folks who make it. Frequently, these vendors have programs where they can take material back. They can take material back from an end user. Frequently they can perform the triage themselves to determine what is and isn't usable out of a piece of material that's reached end of use. They frequently can find ways to reuse systems or reuse components. You find other organizations that are specifically asset recovery and services organizations. They may not be tied to a vendor, or they may have a partnership with a vendor, but that's what they do and that's all they do. And once again, they'll do a similar sort of processes where they will look at equipment, they'll assess whether or not it can be reused whole or in part, and they will identify what to do with it. You'll find recyclers. Once again, waste management companies. Waste management companies are the ones that are, they're really the ones who are going to look at landfilling and incineration. Donatees, right? This is one of the gray areas, and I'll talk a little bit about some of our calls to action and what we need to do next, where, some of the rules are unclear. We have standards for recyclers, but if we decide that the next stop for a piece of equipment is being donated to a school or being donated to a nonprofit, some of the rules in terms of what is and isn't responsible are a little fuzzy, and that's an area that we know now is going to require a little bit of work, because we don't want to disincent those type of processes, but we also want to make sure that we don't turn around, give something to somebody, and then find out 2 weeks later that it's found its way to the bottom of a ditch somewhere. Others are refurbishers and lessors. Sometimes lessors are equipment vendors, sometimes lessors aren't. They decide that they're going to purchase the equipment and they're going to lease it out, and they take it back at end of use. These lessors also, when they get something back, may do an initial triage on the equipment to determine what can and can't be reused. So use models for the metric, right? Talking about, okay, great, we have this wonderful metric, we have this wonderful white paper, what do we kind of do with this next? We think there are kind of steps that an organization is going to follow when looking at this, and which is really good, because if you're looking at incorporating something in the data center maturity model, it's nice to have defined maturity levels or steps. The first is really self-assessment. Understanding what is going on within your organization. What are the material streams? And I'll give you kind of a little example of a spreadsheet in a moment, but what are all the pathways that exist within your company through which material is decommissioned and it leaves your organization? My guess is that almost every single company, when they go in and do the work to identify these material streams, are going to be surprised at how many of them there are, how subtle some of them are, and relatively how little information they had about what organizations are doing with stuff. And we really believe that in some cases, getting to a final number may be a fraction of the real benefit, but just being able to identify those material streams and know what they are for your company may be one of the most important things you can do as a result of using the metric. So once you know what the material streams are, and you have a way to calculate the number for your organization, then we think the next step is to really set some sort of continuous improvement goals. What do we think we can achieve? What are the things that are keeping us from doing better? Are there places where maybe we don't have the right type of organizations in place? Are there places where maybe we haven't been as diligent or as disciplined with respect to who receives the equipment at end of life? Really, the goal in this is that we want organizations, once they're familiar with the metric, to develop a conscious strategy for what they want to do with material at end of life. Now the last use model is, let's say, okay, I've calculated the metric, I know what my material streams are, I've decided to become proactive and develop continuous improvement plans. After that, and what we really think we'd like to see and what would be a big sign of success for the metric is if we start to see the metric aligned with organizations' corporate responsibility reports, where we find the metric being reported in corporate responsibility reports, where we see the goals of the metric and the purpose of the metric aligned with companies' own goals for what they want their sustainability programs to be. And that really is, it's gonna take us a while to get there. Just publishing a white paper doesn't get there. There's gonna be a lot of work to get there, but that's kind of what we're shooting for, to see this show up in organizations' corporate responsibility reports. Okay, so I gave you a formula. It was a simple ratio. I told you how simple it is, and it's not, the ratio is simple. The formulation is simple, but it actually does take work to generate a number. And we did start to work on a little bit of organizational guidance for what it's going to take to calculate the metric. And the first step, like with kind of the first little step in the maturity model for this, is to identify all relevant material streams within your organization. You got to go talk to folks, you got to talk to your IT organization. You may have to talk to a number of different pieces of your IT organization, because IT organizations are not, one holistic thing, but a lot of different organizations within the company. Who's collecting material when you're done with it? When I replace my laptop at Dell, who gets my old laptop? Who takes it? Does it go to the admin? What does the admin do with it? Which organization gets it? What do they do with it afterwards? I guarantee you that the number of ways in which material is exiting your organization are going to be larger, more numerous, and possibly even weirder or stranger than you might imagine. So we got to identify the streams. Once we identify the streams, we need to tag the source organization and the recipient organization for each waste stream. So the definition of a waste stream is a flow of material from a source organization to a recipient. So let's say I have the admins union who's collecting all the used laptops, and they give some stuff to Bob and they give some stuff to Harriet. Those are two independent waste streams, right? It's the admins to Bob, admins to Harriet. Harriet may be handling the stuff responsibly, whereas Bob is not, so we have to separate them. We also need to document the type of material that's moving through the waste stream. Maybe it's servers, maybe it's laptops, maybe it's network equipment. We need to know kind of what it is. And then as we know who the source organization, the recipient organization is, we need to get the numbers. What's the weight of material that's moving through that waste stream? Your recipients should be able to tell you. I think at this point, given that we've just introduced this, nobody is going to be terribly concerned about precision. So if you have to go to vendors and the vendor says, this server weighed 58 pounds, that's probably going to be good enough for now. You may not, I don't think we're looking for folks to measure every single piece of equipment at the moment. But get some number, get something that you're comfortable with that you can say as the relative weight. And then this is going to be a little hard to read, but it's more the message than the details. Get this stuff into some sort of spreadsheet where every row is a different material stream, and you can keep track of a description, the source organization, the recipient organization, the time period of the report, and the amount disposed of and the amount qualified disposed. I just did this as a sample one day. It took me about 30 minutes. Don't get too upset, but Data Center IT, Data Center 2 from the Fort Worth Data Center actually delivers some material to Ditches R Us. And Ditches R Us has a no photographs policy, so we're not really sure what's going on. And then the Kenya call center actually delivers stuff to Harold's Burn-O-Matic, and we don't really want to know anything at all about them, right? So keeping track of kind of where things are going, this allows you to build that number and kind of come up with a final number, which in this case would be 58%. So that's kind of some instructions, a high-level instructions, description of what the metric is and how we think we can calculate it. We wanted to make sure that we reference the domain organizations that have been helpful in providing us the kind of the domain expertise in looking at this. And the first is a group called Solving the E-Waste Problem, which is a non-governmental organization that's associated with United Nations University. The Green Grid, we have not made this public yet, but concurrent with the approval of this white paper, we also have a memorandum of understanding in place with STEP, where they're taking a look at it, review it to make sure that we're correct from a domain point of view, right? To make sure that we're doing the right thing, that we've got the right content in there with regard to the recycling and take-back domain. Another organization that does similar work. They tend to focus maybe more on the consumer space or more on the retail space, is an organization called the Sustainability Consortium out of Arizona State University. Another one that is very interested in, another NGO that's very interested in recycling and take-back, publishes scorecards of major vendors on a regular basis, is the Electronic Take-Back Coalition. We've got some references here to some of the certification standards and directives. As the presentation's uploaded to the site, the links are there for you to reference. So calls to action, kind of next steps. Once again, great, we have a white paper. Anybody can write a white paper. The most important need we have at the moment is to find one or a small set of organizations that are going to commit to piloting the metric. I'm working to talk about this within Dell, to see if we can do it within Dell. I know Melissa Gray is investigating the same thing at Rackspace. We've had some initial interest from eBay. We're looking for, once again, one or more organizations that's actually going to put this through the paces, attempt it and say, hey, task force, here's the things you did well, here's the things that don't work, here are the things we need to change, right? And along with what we think will be a pretty interesting case study on what it actually took to get a number, right? So one or more pilots so we can start really defining the protocols and defining the procedures for calculating this. Concurrently with that, we've got the white paper out there. We now want to get the industry discussion started, industry feedback. Is this helpful? Is this a waste of time? Is this a great idea? Is this not a great idea? Have we approached it right? Have we approached it wrong? How do we get the dialogue started within the industry to discuss this? Now, as we get the pilots and as we get the discussion and feedback going and we start to develop some maturity around the metric itself, then I think we're going to be able to start talking about some best practices. You know, the folks who are really good at this, how do they do disposal? What sort of pathways do they use? What things seem to work really well? What things seem to be received the best? And start to look at a best practices document around commercial disposition of EEE. And then along with, after we get through that kind of best practices, then I think we can start really looking at maybe in detailed assessment of disposition pathways and which ones we might prefer, which ones we might recommend over others. Okay, so thank you for letting me brief you on, once again, something that's a little different and a little new for the Green Grid, and a couple of reasons. We had a lot of great help from folks from the industry. A lot of companies within the Green Grid brought in folks into this group that really weren't otherwise engaged with the Green Grid on these issues because they came from a different side of the green IT space. Folks like Ezra Benjamin from EMC, Tom Calderwood from Oracle, Mike Watson from Dell gave us a lot of their time and their expertise to really make sure that this is a collaboration between the folks who understand data center and IT operations and the folks who understand recycling and take-back processes. So I think now, I got like 10 minutes left here. I'll open it up. Questions? Anybody's got any? Yes, Mr. Wong.
What I've been told is that if you're a business in Europe, nothing less than 100% is acceptable. In fact, according to some folks, the regulators will come in and shut you down if 100% is not achieved. Now, if that's truly the case, and I haven't gone back to double check, I believe some of the sources that have told me this, isn't then the metric really for those organizations that we can't have a lot of influence or participation over? Was it really just for the some of the larger companies and the data center companies and so forth? I doubt if that 58% was acceptable.
Europe can have a rule that says something like this needs to be 100%. My guess is a rule like that is going to be specifically tied to certain types of disposal, certain conditions. So for example, I don't know right now that includes donations, right? I don't know what all that includes. I also, while an organization may be supposed to reach 100%, it's very possible that when you look at all of the material streams in a large organization, you've got some holes in places. And you need something like this metric to help you get there. Something else that's the case is that there are companies and there are organizations that exist entirely within Germany. But then there are also organizations that are based in Germany that have operations in the United States, have operations in Asia, have operations in Africa. And remember, once again, this metric is supposed to be applied at a global level, not at a country-specific level. So, you know, we may find that there are some folks who can hit 100% right off the bat. And by the way, if they can and they do, we want to document how they're doing it and let other folks know. The folks who are guaranteeing that everything is being handled responsibly, here's how they're doing it, and here's what they have in their area. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I had another question with regards to, I mean, it'd be nice to have a goal set based on at least our company's expectations at this point, right? And if 100% is it, and we want to get everybody else to go in that direction, it'd be great if the Green Grid went ahead and said, that's it. We want to get to 100% everywhere.
You know, I'm not going to do it right now. And the reason why I'm not going to do that right now is because I want more data. I want to understand what's going on. There may be parts of the world where it is impossible to hit 100% because the recycling infrastructure just hasn't been developed there. And we need to know that, we need to surface it, we need to make a list so we know where to work. So I'm not going to say right now, you know, maybe after we've done a couple of pilots, after we've got some initial results, we start to see patterns of what kind of results we're getting and where we're getting those sorts of results, then setting a goal may make a little bit more sense.
Two other questions. One, how does it reflect against upcoming items like EPEAT for servers, which addresses material recovery? Secondly is, I like the topic of donations, but aren't we going to try to cut responsibility, at least, for the materials once it gets donated?
Well, so I actually think donations is an area where we're going to have some more work, right? We may start seeing things like, I'm willing to donate this to you, but you have to guarantee that when you're done with it, you're going to do something responsible with it. With regard to the question about EPEAT, remember, EPEAT is a producer metric. It's a label that's, you know, it's guidelines, standards, specifications that are designed into the product by the manufacturer, right? This is a metric for the end user, right? The end user may say, I'm going to have EPEAT equipment because EPEAT equipment is going to help me to get a better score on this metric, right? But this metric doesn't really have anything to do with EPEAT itself. One's a producer metric, one's an end user metric. Other questions? Yes?
Yes, I'm from eBay, and I've been asked to be part of the pilot of this. And I've been actually working with my disposal vendors. We're EStewards period, global period vendors. We don't deal with the smaller regional ones. So it's a lot easier to get good reports and information. One thing I've asked them to go to a little more detail is because I'm also very interested, not that nothing hits landfill, but also I'm interested in majority of the hardware is resold, and then next is repurposed or broken down into the commodities, not commodities actually, components, and then down into the commodities. And it's something harder for them to do, but they're starting to do is to give me a breakdown, a percentage of this weight and what went where.
So I think that's really valuable. We did discuss that in the task force, and I think we came to the conclusion that we're going to have to get this going first. But I know within a number of individuals there's interest in maybe some sort of subsequent metric that really measures how much value is retained as the equipment is disposed, right? So I don't know where it's going to go right now. I think we got our hands full just kind of get this started. But I would say, if eBay is in a position to calculate additional data and really understand more, it's going to make a fantastic case study. Henry. So, once again, this is actually related to the whole ownership question. Who makes the decision as to when a bring your own device is decommissioned? That's, yes. So then the organization is not responsible for it. I mean, if the user said, this is my smartphone, I'm going to bring it in, I'm going to use it, I'm also taking responsibility for it. Now, an organization might come up with some sort of ancillary program for its employees to kind of help with that, but it's not within the scope of the metric, right? Because the organization does not control the disposition of the metric, of the device. Other questions? All right. Thank you all very, very much. Enjoy your networking lunch.
So lunch is taking place directly outside.